hopefully this presentation in today's class will make all of that a lot clearer. So as we go through, be thinking about what you brought up in the papers. So what we're going to do is take a trip to some of my favorite locations. But just to bring us back, one of the reasons that I love teaching in the Viz Lab and I love this day, I've tortured you guys for about 2 weeks, right? This is kind of your reward, partly. But it's also incredibly relevant to what we have been doing in those painful earlier weeks. And before we have fun, I have to unfortunately bring you back to all of the pain and misery that we went through. So, do you remember this painful activity? Right? It was really, really difficult because it is an arbitrary geopolitical construct. We are all aware of that now. So, reminder of something to get us oriented on the map before we kind of move out into the world. I had told you guys, right, not only is the Middle East this construct, but we also have to contend with the Arab world, which is about 450 million people, give or take. And you'll see a map of that coming up on the left in just a second. These are the countries of the Arab League, right? If you recall, the Muslim world is almost 2 billion people, much, much bigger. That map is going to pop up right over there. And both, neither, and one of them may or may not be, quote, unquote, the Middle East because it's complicated, right? We're all still hurting after the map exercise, which is totally normal. Now, I'm going to flash back to those word clouds because this is really going to set up the stage for what we're going to do today. So, you remember I made you guys fill out the first things that pop into your mind when we hear certain phrases. So we have a baseline, or sort of a collective unconscious, I guess, of the class and our associations. This is what you guys think about when you hear the phrase, the Middle East. So, again, we have desert, conflict, oil, Muslim, Islam, war. We went over this a bit last time. And now when you hear the word Islam, the things that you think about are in this word cloud coming up in a second. Religion, God, Muhammad, prayer, Mecca, and extremism. And then we pop over to Arab to refresh your memory. And what you guys came up with for Arab off the top of your head, right at the beginning of our class, is mostly desert and Middle East. So one thing that happened a lot in your response papers is people said variation of, I'm really embarrassed that I didn't have this knowledge, or, you know, I learned something and I feel like quasi-ashamed kind of came through. And listen, I told you guys this from the beginning. I don't want you to be embarrassed about not knowing something. I am your professor. I do not know everything about the Middle East because it is impossible, right? We all remember that tirade. However, today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at, yes, you came into this class with biases and assumptions and preconceptions. We all did. We all have them. But I don't want you to feel bad about it for another reason. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look at why and where you got those assumptions, because they're not just yours. You inherited sort of a way to think about this part of the world. And a lot of you mentioned the media as being important in that. Totally true. But that's not the whole story. So we are going to basically set up the stage for you to understand why and how you started kind of thinking about this part of the world the way that you did, even with no study of it before, virtually at all. So the first phrase on your term sheet is going to be really important for the first half of the class. And this is Napoleon's conquest in Egypt and Syria. And a couple things that I want you to know about that before we dive right in is that basically the Napoleonic conquest kind of marks what most historians consider to be the quote-unquote origin of modernity in this part of the world. Generally, that's what people sort of mark as the starting point of the modern Middle East. But what I want you to think about as really important background is that from this very first moment in time, this very first moment in modern time, quote unquote, the so-called Middle East was militarily mediated. All right? So I'll say this one more time. So from the very first point of contact in the quote unquote modern world, through Napoleon's conquest, the Middle East was militarily mediated. And what does this lunatic up here mean by that? What I mean is that Napoleon sent with him artists, he sent with him writers and scientists and academics. Basically, this initial sort of modern contact, one more time, involved a whole bunch of representations, sometimes that were completely fictional, sometimes not, all right? But you're inheriting sort of a background of representation and conflict from the very beginning. Make sense? We all good to go? One more thing before we dive in. This particular campaign was launched basically as a proxy war. So essentially, what Napoleon is concerned about at the time is checking British interests and access to the East Indies and India, but he doesn't feel strong enough to confront the British directly. Also, there's another really important thing about Napoleon. He had a Napoleon complex. I'm sure you've all heard this. Kind of a little bit of an ego. So he wanted to basically retrace Alexander the Great's steps on a personal level, and that's the first part of what we're going to be doing and where we're going to be going. We're retracing Napoleon, retracing Alexander the Great's steps. So we should go ahead and leave Colgate. Yeah, you can start this thing now. We're going to go ahead and take off from Colgate and get started. And of course, let's take a journey to the, let's see, where do you want to go? Let's go to Paris to start out with. Because why not? Has anyone been to Paris before? All right, good number of you. So, can anybody tell me, do you recognize what we are coming into? Wait, there we go. Yes, absolutely correct. This is the Arc de Triomphe, or Triumphal Arch. And we're going to go ahead and touch down because I want to set the stage for you on a couple different things about this. So this is one of the most famous monuments in the world, right? And it initially was commissioned in 1806 by Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. And it was supposed to essentially honor military veterans of French campaigns across the world. And if you have been to Paris, even if you haven't, what's really interesting about this arch for our purposes is that it's a locus for militarism and nationalism sort of celebrations by France. It stretches from the courtyard of the Louvre all the way to La Défense on this axis. And that's basically where we're going to set the stage for our trip and for the 1798 to 1801 conquest in Egypt and Syria. And again, this is basically kind of a proxy war situation. Keep that in the back of your mind. One more thing to tell you about Napoleon to make it really, really clear. I'm going to be showing you guys a lot of art today. We don't need to memorize the titles of the paintings or the artists now, but I want you to, again, remember military mediation for this part of the world. Here's a portrait of Napoleon that was done way after he died. Way after he died. Because consider one thing. Napoleon was a master propagandist. So we are looking at fine art. We're also looking at propaganda. Part of this is what shaped all of the ways in which we think about this part of the world called quote-unquote the Middle East. So, again, I just want to emphasize one more time for you that when this conquest begins, you have artists go along with the military. It's basically the equivalent of an embedded photographer with the army today, for example. All right? So we're retracing his steps, and again, he was trying to relive Alexander the Great's trajectory. So the first place that he went was Malta. Because this is not a military history class, I'm skipping over several different battles, and we're going really quickly because I want to get to the incredibly important part. So there's Malta. You can just wave at it, check it out. From Malta, Napoleon goes over to Egypt. And the first stop is Alexandria on the coast. He doesn't really stay here too long because the thing is, again, proxy warfare, he doesn't want to meet the British directly at sea. Their navy is a lot stronger. So from Alexandria on the African continent, we're crossing over into the area that is known as the Levant generally. So this is contemporary Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, over here. Now, I want to show you a painting that took place shortly after this campaign. That's really important in art history, but also in understanding what I mean by thinking about how we came to understand this stuff. So this particular painter actually started this in 1804, a couple years after the campaign ended, right? Relatively close to the conquest in time. Now it's called Napoleon Visits the Plague-Stricken in Jaffa or Yafo, Arabic or Hebrew, depending on what language we're using. And what's super interesting and important about this, there's several things, but this particular artist actually went with the military to several battles and became prominent for a lot of military genre paintings, okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is, if you first looked at this keyhole doorway, what building might you think that this is in? What kind of a building? Yeah?
Didn't you say it was like prominent in Islamic architecture?
It is prominent in Islamic architecture. Absolutely correct. What kind of building do you just assume? You guys know I'm going to trick you, but say the one I'm trying to trick you with. Yeah?
A mosque.
We might think it's a mosque, right? Excellent guess. It's actually an Armenian monastery, interestingly enough, but it shares those visual forms. The more important reason I'm showing you this now in this particular class is the fact that one of the reasons this painting was commissioned a couple years after the conquest, this is showing how caring Napoleon is as a military leader. He's visiting these plague-struck victims who are in his military. But there's a rumor going around at the same time that Napoleon decided to have sick soldiers executed with a poison. So what does he do to counter these rumors? Well, he commissions this painting right here that shows how dedicated and caring he is. It's basically like a photo op, except it's fine high art, okay? So again, I want you to think of some of the highest pieces of fine art that we have in context in terms of shaping your worldview and approach to this part of the world, and why that map exercise was so messy and hard and complicated, and where these ideas came forth that you don't need to apologize for having in a response paper, ever. You inherited them, so we gotta pick them apart. Okay, so Napoleon basically starts to freak out again because the British are coming, doesn't want to meet them at sea, so what does he do? He up and heads over back to Egypt. Yes?
Was the Suez Canal built at this time?
That will take us way off course.
All right.
Unfortunately, but the Suez Canal we'll get back to in class later on. Okay, so now where Napoleon goes is over to present-day Cairo, specifically to Giza, which is about, if you've been to Cairo, even if you haven't, it's about 10 miles outside of the city center, and this is where the pyramid complex with the Sphinx is. So Napoleon takes about 25,000 troops to this particular area and gets ready for battle. Now, any good tourist that goes to the pyramid has to do the classic Orientalist thing of getting a guide. So this guy looked like he would be a lot of fun to hang out with, so we chose him. So I want you to get a sense of how monumental these structures are and how impressive they would be if you were seeing them in person the first time. Doesn't matter if it's Napoleon's time or our time. Enormous. Okay, so you've all heard of the Sphinx, right? The Great Sphinx? Fun fact for you to throw out at trivia. The name of the Sphinx in Arabic is actually the father of fear, the father of terror. It's supposed to strike awe into your heart. But I want you to get a sense of basically the perspective and the proportions of the Sphinx versus the actual pyramids. Why am I telling you all this? It will become clear in just a minute. Basically, this guy is about 67 feet high, all right, dwarfed by the pyramids. Absolutely dwarfed by the pyramids. Teeny tiny in comparison. Okay, so now, before the battle that takes place about 10 miles away from here with 25,000 troops, there's a story that you read about in historical accounts of this particular battle. And in the story, Napoleon's rallying his troops at the pyramids. You want to pop up the next? Okay. So, Napoleon's rallying his troops at the pyramids. And one of the things he says to them is, soldiers, look at the tops of the pyramids up here. Monumental, right? Look at the tops of the pyramids. Remember that from the peaks of these pyramids before you, 40 centuries of history contemplates you. Well, guys, there's just one problem with that account. Where this battle took place, you couldn't even see the pyramids. All right? You could not even see them. But history recorded it because, let's be honest, it's an epic story, right? In any case, we start to have a genre of portrayals and paintings of Napoleon, this great conqueror, in front of the pyramids, in front of the Sphinx. This is another piece that was done way after Napoleon's death. But again, you can imagine that, especially way before the invention and dissemination of photography, right, this kind of imagery would really, really be something else if you were looking at it for the first time. Especially in the conquest of what you saw in the Said video, of all of this interest in the exotic and the Near East and the Orient, and especially Egypt. But what else do they want you to know about that in particular as backstory? You know, I think that's enough for now. So, anyone been to the Louvre in here? All right, a lot of you. For the rest of you, we're going to go. Keep in mind, Napoleon's campaign, 3 years, super short, right? However, it had a massively disproportionate impact in terms of the legacy that it brought to this part of the world. We see things like the printing press that were brought alongside, but it also impacted quote-unquote us, right? Because these images were being sent back to the metropole or back to Europe and started shaping the way that we think about the quote-unquote modern Middle East. So let's go ahead and check out another pyramid in the courtyard of the Louvre. One pyramid to another pyramid. Why am I showing you the Louvre, other than that this is a really pretty photo? A couple different reasons. So the Louvre, as you know, is one of the biggest museums in the world, one of the most popular and most frequently visited. It was actually opened in 1793. Okay, so think about the timeline here. And the expansion and conquest of Napoleon and others is something that contributed immensely to what you see being shown at the Louvre now. And you can see this basically history of French imperial expansion in the curatorial departments today. So you've got like Near Eastern antiquities, Islamic art, Egyptian art, and you also have one other really, really important collection of Orientalist paintings. Now, you'll remember from the Said video that Orientalism isn't just a style of thinking about the East, quote unquote. It's also an art genre of 19th century primarily, French painting. And I want to show you two paintings in particular that are at the Louvre, and they'll set up the stage for the second part of the class. So, again, I was talking about this idea, right, of basically an embedded photographer, but back then. Well, there's basically two types of Orientalist artists. The first type is what you're looking at on the left. This is by a guy named Delacroix. You don't need to know his name for now. And this is entitled Women of Algiers in Their Apartment. It's done about 1834. Why I am showing you this? For several reasons. Two types of Orientalist painters. The first type, they actually got to go, sort of, to this region, messy region that we call the Middle East. Now, how much access they had to everyday life and real people is subject to different contexts. What you're looking at here has been praised by some people for being very close to reality in terms of its accurate depictions of clothing and objects and, you know, the decor, basically. However, let me tell you a little bit of context specifically about this particular painter. Delacroix actually joined a diplomatic mission, first to Morocco. Okay, so he went first to Morocco, and then when he was passing back on his way home, he spent about 3 days in Algeria. About 3 days. Essentially by chance, he gets a glimpse into the interior of a home. You've got another term on your sheet that says harem. This is going to be really important also next week, because I want to break down and deconstruct this term in particular. But harems, you know, you normally think about a bunch of women hanging around like a Hugh Hefner figure, right? This in itself is kind of an Orientalist concept and cooptation of what that word actually means. It's related in Arabic to the words for sacred, the word that you would use for the off-limits part of the house that only your family could go to. It's also related to the word for sanctuary, literal sanctuary, okay, and haram. So when you hear this, I want you to be thinking about the word harem as a spatial idea. And we'll get into this a lot more next week. But it's not just a bunch of women or concubines. It's basically someone's family, and embedded in this idea is the notion of something that is so sacred to you that it's off limits and you want to protect it. That's basically the general idea. Okay, so this is supposedly a harem scene to get us back on track. Although the decor is pretty accurate, there's no narrative and you have no idea what's going on in this space. Basically, the only sort of engagement with any kind of storyline might be in this woman's expression right here, and she doesn't look particularly enthusiastic about the fact that you're staring into her bedroom, right? Another interesting fact before we jump over to another painting in the Louvre is the fact that Delacroix painted this again later on in life, but it also inspired people like Picasso and other artists like Matisse later on. And again, consider for a second the fact that this image came primarily from Delacroix's imagination, even though he physically went, because he just got a glimpse. And then in turn, he inspired the biggest names in modern art, right? Picasso. Everybody's heard of him. So, over on the right, we are going to check out an example of a painting from another type of Orientalist. This is the type of Orientalist painter that didn't even get to go. So he was painting entirely from his imagination. This is a painting by a guy named Ang. Don't really need to worry about that too much. What I do want you to know about this gentleman in particular, this painting right here is supposed to depict a hammam, or a Turkish bath. That's generally what it's called in English or French. So a public bathhouse. They're very, very common in North Africa and parts of the Middle East. And they are gender segregated, as you would probably expect. I mean, fun fact, this isn't what really they look like, okay? This was very purposefully erotic. Okay, purposefully erotic. So, when you're thinking about all of these terms that came up, the assumptions that we were talking about the first couple weeks of class, right? That Islam, say, is oppressive to women, naturally and across space and time, that this is a conflict-ridden area since time immemorial, and so on and so forth. I want you to keep in mind that part of the reason you've inherited these sorts of assumptions, which can sometimes be true, but not always, came from imagery like this. Another couple important facts about Ang before we move on to some more material. So, one story I absolutely love about this painting, I think it's so fantastic. He painted this at the end of his life. He was really, really old when he did this work, in his 80s, and he was very, very proud of the fact that this is explicitly supposed to be erotic imagery. And again, painted from his imagination. drawing basically on some imagery that had been sent back with those embedded artists and writers and so on and so forth. Some of which, again, remember, was fake news, basically, or fictional. Some of it. Not all of it, but some of it. Okay, so one of the things he said about this painting, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact quote, but he said that it made him very proud to declare, when you look at this painting and know that he is in his 80s, I assure you that I still burn with the fires of a 30-year-old man. Okay? So again, explicitly an erotic painting, completely from the imagination. Even in the case of Delacroix, he didn't have more than a couple days in Algeria and a couple moments of glimpsing inside an interior. And so, there's one more thing that I want you to think about before we leave the Louvre and actually go to my home away from Hamilton, Algeria. I want you to think about one thing, because I said at the beginning, the concept of the Middle East, visually and in terms of representation, from the origin of modern quote-unquote contact, is militarily mediated. This is really important to think about. If an army from Pennsylvania invades Hamilton tonight, and they have an embedded photographer with them, and they come into my house, I am highly unlikely to say, yeah, sure, you want to come take a shower with me? Do you guys see what I'm saying here? There's a number of reasons that access to private spaces in an imperial situation is not going to be representationally accurate, right? It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a religious culture, because we can't forget about the fact that this is a military conquest. And you're not likely to invite a conquering army into your shower. I mean, at least I'm not. So that's one of the things that's going on here. But there are other reasons. We have to be more nuanced than just, these are all stereotypes and no access whatsoever. There's also architectural reasons for this, and socio-cultural religious principles in the society that they are conquering or engaged in conquest. So, I want to take you to my house in the capital of Algeria, in Algiers, because I'd rather take you with me than have us try to learn about what this part of the world is like through Orientalist imagery in a museum. So let's go. A couple things I want you to know, just generally to give you a sense of the dates. Now, a couple of years after the conquest of the Levant, or Egypt and Syria, basically, there's domestic turmoil going on in France. A great way to distract your domestic public from troubles at home and to rally sort of national sentiment is imperial expansion. Obviously, this is an essentialist view, but this isn't a French history class, so we're going with the contours. So I want you to know that basically from 1827 till 1962, Algeria is either undergoing conquest by the French or it is controlled by the French. Okay? 1827-ish to 1962, that's a really long time. And this happened after Napoleon went back after those first 3 years. And incidentally, in 1848, France actually declared that Algeria wasn't just a colony, but it was physically part of France. Not even a colony anymore. So that's a long time. So let's land on my roof and have this make a little bit more sense. Okay, so do you remember back in the word associations? Almost everybody hears Middle East or Arab or Islam, etc., and thinks automatically of deserts and sand. You don't normally think of the Mediterranean, but this is looking out onto the Bay of Algiers from my rooftop in the Mediterranean out into this beautiful, vivid blue sea. I don't know about you guys, I'm loving the weather today, but maybe you're homesick for Hamilton, I don't really know. But you don't have to worry because it starts snowing on my roof looking over the bay into the Mediterranean. Again, think about all of these things that came to mind, like sand and desert and heat, not Mediterranean climates and snowstorms. But that is, in fact, what we have in a lot of the so-called Middle East. So now, let's see, what do I want you to know about demographics? Well, let's go ahead and visit a place called the Qasba. This is on your term sheet also. We'll come back to it next week. But the Qasba is basically, it's the Arabic term for a citadel, like a walled fort, essentially. And you're looking at it from the air right here. What I want you to know about it is basically this is the traditional city, or the old city before the French conquest. And if you can stop right there for a sec. Now, I'm sure you can tell just from looking at the sky that this is sort of a grid formation of urban planning, right? Everybody sees that it's more or less geometric and linear and reminiscent of, say, the Paris landscape when we looked at that from space. But within the Qasba, or this walled sort of fortress area, it starts to look like fractals. You don't have a grid structure, okay? Basically, think again of the word harem, and I told you this was an ordering principle and like a sociocultural value too. Essentially, most traditional architecture in the Middle East and North Africa specifically is centered inward to ensure privacy. So what I'm saying is, yeah, part of the Orientalist difficulty in accessing interiors had to do with things like gender segregation, right? Absolutely. The fact that they were coming in with conquerors, but it also actually had to do with the urban topography. And I really want to take you with me inside the Qasba because it is almost impossible to actually even hear. This is the closest we can get. But it's really, really difficult to get a sense of this space. But I want to, as much as possible, show you what I'm talking about. I'm sorry? Okay, oh, yeah, one more thing. Very, very critical to understand, too. All right, let me just throw a couple dates at you. We'll come back to them. Again, this is just background information. But the revolution against France to finally free Algeria of colonial control, as far as the Algerians were concerned, it kicks off in 1954, and Algeria gets its independence in 1962. So, how many people in this room have seen the film The Battle of Algiers? All right, a couple people. Don't worry, you'll probably run into it in other classes. You can watch it for free on YouTube, also Canopy. Really a seminal film, and it takes place at the Qasba, inside the Qasba. Basically, this is a moment in the Algerian Revolution, but what I want to show you here is the fact that right before the US invaded Iraq, 2003, the Pentagon screened the Battle of Algiers. Why did they screen the Battle of Algiers? Part of the reason was basically to prepare troops on how you fight an insurgency and counterinsurgency. And the space of the Qasba is where a lot of Algerians, basically was a seminal battleground in the revolution, because only someone that grew up in this labyrinthine space is going to be able to really, really know how to maximize it. If you're not from there, you're not going to be able to draw a map of it. I know this doesn't make sense yet, but we will go inside and you will see exactly what I mean. But, yeah, so the Pentagon screened this film, trying to learn the lessons of counterinsurgency, which apparently we did not quite so well. But we're still at the Qasba, looking down from the air, and now, pause for 1 second. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do, I'm going to show you a view of the Qasba from the side. But the context for the video that you're looking at is fascinating, because now the Qasba is sort of falling apart. A group of Algerian architects got together and they were basically doing a historic preservation workshop. So this is their little fun model video of the Kasbah built out of sugar cubes. And what I want you to realize while you're watching this is that within the central space, basically architecture is built vertically instead of horizontally. That is part of the reason that it's so crowded and so congested and so hard to get a sense of how this actually looks inside. And also, they picked the song Rock the Kasbah as the soundtrack. So old is this musical group, they're even older than me, like Crypt Keeper, ancient, but it's a great soundtrack for what we're gonna see. Quick clip. So be thinking about how this looks in space, and I have a pointer and I'll be showing you like where the rooftop that you saw previously is situated. Take a look. This is basically the Kasbah from the side. You saw it from the air, but now we're looking at the side. In sugar cubes, of course. But this is really difficult to imagine, right? Much less to get a sense from reading a book, or even looking at one singular still image. This is the bay, and this is their little model of it. There's one more view. That's fine. Okay, so now you have a sense of how this place looks from the side. You can tell that with the architecture going up instead of out, it is crowded, it is congested. So now we're actually going to go into the Kasbah, to the widest part, and you're looking at basically the commercial sector, not residential areas. It would be widest, streetwise, in the commercial sector. And if you can spin around, basically there's not a whole lot of place to stay out of sight. So if you happen to be coming into this terrain as a member of the military, you're gonna stick out, right? You're gonna stick out, and people will be able to sort of observe you. Can you?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Such as, so you can see that even at this widest part of the Kasbah, it's really difficult to get a sense of the space, right? And this isn't a private home even. This is just where you would go to buy things. And he's coming around right now, but even today, if you don't look like you could be Algerian, or, you know, if you stand out in some striking way, people will wonder what you're doing there. This is triply the case if it's an army. So that guy is kind of suspicious of this particular photo. But it gives you, again, a sense of the widest public space within the Kasbah. Now, what do I have next? Is this another video? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Okay, now what you're about to see, Henry, this might make you feel a little sick, so see what you can do and then shut your eyes. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna watch a home video of walking through the Kasbah. So we're not just looking at it from the side anymore, we're actually gonna go into the interior, and you'll get a sense even more of how the space is really, really hard to access, and what that looks like and feels like when you're physically there. So we're going to take a brief walk. Oh yeah, this one is totally fine. No, it's fine. You can leave it like that. So you can see that buildings are built on top of one another instead of side by side in a grid sort of, you know, even Hamilton, even the village, right? Everything is very narrow, space is very cramped, everything is sort of built inwards. So if you peek through into an interior, you can see everything is closed off to outside. And we will come back to this when we talk about space and social organization, I think, next week. But before we do that, I wanted to give you this experience so you know what we're talking about. Now, the second film that we're going to check out, this is basically a short little music video that a guy who lives in the Kasbah made, who is also a DJ. Henry, this might see how you feel on this one too. But basically the translation of the title of this is like My Hood, or what have you. And it's a different walk in perspective through this part of the old city, and you'll be able to see a little bit of the bay from additionally another perspective, and the interiors as well. so you'll get a sense of that. Oh wait, I have the home photo first. Okay, sorry guys. Before we do that, I'm taking you inside the house. All right, so what I want you to realize, this is going to start basically spinning around so you get a sense, but this is a domestic interior. And if you look up top at the roof, you see that it's cut out and essentially structured around a courtyard with an open air roof up here. Okay, the reason for this is, again, this concept of the haram or the harem. The interior space should be private. There's a big divide between the public and the private, and the architectural topography reflects that. One more reason why it's really hard for Orientalist artists to represent what was going on inside. A, they were unwelcome. B, in terms of topography, you can't really figure out what it looks like unless you have an invite. And again, everything is structured sort of staring inward. So around the central courtyard. And now we are going to take a tour back out through the Hasbah, through DJ Mendy's My Hood. And if you are a cat lady like me, an old cat lady, you'll see cats running around in the streets. There's tons of little kittens that inhabit the Hasbah, which makes me really happy. Okay. So, yeah, Henry, this might mess with you. Sorry. And I just want you to inhabit this space for a minute. So, I'm going to hang out and listen to music for a couple minutes as I point out something for you. So this is a museum space, and you can see you've got your fountain, and that's the central courtyard again. Open out to the sky. And you see the same keyhole doorway that we've talked about before. You see how, again, how narrow these streets are and how compressed. And that's for a reason. Many, many, many different reasons.
يا عشيق واجبني على قوالك أسرارك مسراني يا عشيق واجبني على قوالك.
But since the French came into Algiers, basically they built a whole administrative and French city outside. And you see that in the aerial we saw before, right? The grid structured streets. We'll get a better view of that in a second. Some of the homes in the French Quarter, again, we're looking out on the bay from the top of this Hasbah area. Everybody has satellite television. You see the satellite dishes all over the rooftop. And if you feel a little claustrophobic, the first time that you go, you're going to feel claustrophobic in real life. Tight space. Awesome stray cats. Hello, buddy. Alright, so now what do I have coming next? Let me check. So do you guys feel like you have a slightly better understanding of how the space sort of feels and works in this part of the world? Now, before I show you what I'm going to show you next, let me ask you a question. How many of you, have you ever heard of Algeria in relation to American history? Ever? Maybe one person, but Algeria is not this totally distant area in the far-off Middle East that has had no relevance whatsoever for domestic American politics. And I want to underscore something for you because, let's bring up this image. A couple different images. All right, has anyone heard of the Black Panther Party? Not the new one, but the initial Black Panther Party in the 60s and 70s. It started as basically a defense organization against police brutality in Oakland, California. In any case, this isn't American civil rights history class, so I can't spend too much time on this. But what is important is the fact that the Black Panthers, or several members from the Black Panthers, actually went into exile in Algeria, Algiers in particular. And independent Algeria, post-colonial Algeria, invited them in because one of the nicknames for post-colonial Algeria is the Mecca of Revolution. Okay, the Mecca of Revolution. Now, I told you that Algeria won its independence through essentially an armed struggle against the French that started in 1954. One of the things that you read about for today was the Cold War. Throughout the Cold War, Algeria is a non-aligned actor, and one of the things that lives on from their own revolutionary war of independence is this sort of stance where they want to champion the underdog and support independence movements everywhere. We talked about the Western Sahara in class before, and Algeria is a big supporter of Western Saharan independence from Morocco. So it's kind of a diplomatic issue between the two of them. But so, before we leave the issue of the Black Panthers, I'm going to show you one more interesting just image, I think, outside the Hasba. And you're going to be looking at Stokely Carmichael and Eldridge Cleaver, two members of the Black Panthers, at this Hotel Saint-Georges in the new quarter of the city. That's basically the place to go party today. So 1969, interestingly, if you're interested in this stuff, there's actually a documentary that Eldridge Cleaver made in Algiers that came out in 69. So there's one more interesting layer to this. It's not just the American part of the Americas that Algeria is connected to. I am sure that you will recognize one gentleman in this picture coming up.
Sorry.
No worries. Okay, so one of the guys in this photo is Boumediene, an early president of independent Algeria. Do you recognize the other guy? Anybody? Okay, is the guy on the right or the left the president of Algeria? Yell it out. Yes, this is the president, Boumediene. Who's this guy? What? Everybody knew this morning. Come on, guys, stand out. Nah, it's not Castro, but you're close. You're warm. It's Che. It's Che Guevara. All right. So the man you're looking at on the left, Che Guevara, went to Algeria several times. And again, remember, one of the nicknames for Algeria after independence is the Mecca of Revolution. They sponsored a lot of international exchanges, okay, with other third worldists is what this movement was called, with other revolutionary actors and basically communists, even Marxist Lenin sort of ideological affiliations. This isn't probably what you would think of when you hear the phrase Algeria at all, right? But there were contacts extensively during the Cold War, in particular, between, say, Vietnam, the area contemporary North Korea, Angola, Cuba, many, many different places that were non-aligned actors. And Algeria was a hub of this. The first Pan-African festival actually happened in Algiers in 1969. So it basically was sort of the center of a lot of global movements that you don't really even necessarily think about, including movements that have to do with our own country. And now, say what? Oh yeah. A couple just sort of visual signifiers for you are coming up. All right, so we are outside the Kasbah now. We're in the new city. You'll see a better image of what that looks like in a second. But, so this is the street sign in the new city. Che Guevara Boulevard. What is super interesting about that, other than everything else I've told you, is this was renamed after the revolution, and its old name was Avenue of the Republic, as in the Republic of France. Now remember, in 1848, I told you, France declared that Algeria was physically France, not just a colony anymore. So it's pretty significant that they renamed the Avenue of the Republic to Che Guevara specifically. And then again, just one more time, let me beat it into your heads. Algeria's nickname is the Mecca of Revolution. And all over the city and the country, you see these massive monumental art sculptures and public memorials and so on and so forth that emphasize very much autonomy politically, and they almost have like a Soviet sort of realist propaganda feel to them, because hashtag Cold War, we'll get there. But this is one in the new city, and now I want to show you exactly what this Breaking the Chains sculpture overlooks, because it overlooks a really important building. How are you doing, Henry? Good so far? All right. Okay, so the Qasba's up here, basically. And now, I told you we're in the new city. This is the first stop that we're going to check out in the new city. And I know this is not going to sound terribly exciting. I swear to you it is. We're going to the post office. And you can see that the streets look a lot different, right? Outside of the Qasba. Why am I taking you to the post office? Other than the fact that I forgot to mail something. I don't know. Let's make up a reason. There are several really important reasons I'm taking you to the post office. This is what it looks like from the front. And you can see again that the French sort of urban planning that started after the conquest of Algeria is along a grid formation, very different from the Qasba. So this enormous building is the central post office, and it is a landmark in Algiers, in the capital. So let's go inside for a minute, because I guarantee you, I mean, now you guys know I'm always trying to do trick questions to blow your minds a little bit. But if I showed you this in class and I said, what kind of building do you think this comes from? What would you tell me? What would you guess? Guess wrong, it's fine. Really, Max? Okay, a post office, because you are psychic. Anyway, a lot of people would think that this comes from a mosque, and we can certainly understand why, right? It's Arabic calligraphy. So maybe that would be a religious building. Let's check out another image from inside. Now we are looking at some very interesting material. It's kind of an Art Nouveau mailbox. Why am I shifting this dramatically? Let's look up at the ceiling before I give away the answer. The ceiling also might look like you're checking out the dome inside of a mosque. But again, we're at the post office. So what is really wild about this is the post office wasn't built by Algerians. It wasn't decorated by Algerians. It was built and designed and decorated, including that Arabic calligraphy inside, by the French. And it was actually an important headquarters, sort of, for the French administration during the colonial period. And they built it based on what they thought that it should look like to be quote-unquote authentically Middle Eastern. Right? So now, we are, I think, are we doing the drone thing now? All right, Henry, I'm flagging you. Yeah.
So who lives in the Qasba rather than the new part? Like, is it just like who would want to live in the Qasba rather than the new part? If you understand that question.
I do, and I'm going to answer that super quickly because we're going to come back to this stuff. But for now, yeah, people still live in the Qasba, absolutely. Right now, I think there's about between 50 and 70,000, if I recall correctly. Now it's sort of run down, and it's basically the impoverished.
Is it like more of a slums type area?
in Algiers it is.
Right.
Now, when we talk about old cities, which are called the Medinas, and we'll talk about them in class next week, you've got kind of a gentrification situation where a lot of foreigners are buying up property in the old city, but the Kasbah is not at that point, because Algeria is a much different situation. So basically, the people that live there now are mostly poor. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
All right, and I just want to warn you, because the next video, see how much you can make, but it might make you feel sick giving concussion. All right, so we're still at the post office, you guys, but we are going to take a drone, and we're going to start at the post office because of something really, really important. I want you to help me celebrate Algerian independence. So we're going to watch a fireworks show that starts out at this big post office downtown. Why does it take place there? Well, because again, it used to be sort of a center for French colonial administration. So, let's take it away. Projecting the Algerian flag after you won your independence is one way to celebrate. And there we are. Okay, so now you're gonna get this drone eye view of basically Alger la Blanche, Algiers the White, which is one of the nicknames in French because of the way the buildings look off the coast of the Mediterranean. There's a couple things I want you to keep in mind. Again, think of those spaces we saw inside the Kasbah and how radically different they look, and just how these changes took place. Again, see the inside of a traditional architectural space, right? That's centered inward. But let's fly out. My house, the roof that you were on is... Where am I in space? I will find it in a minute. But if you look at these architectural forms, these buildings look really, really French, right? Because they were, a lot of the time. Okay, my house is back there. And now it would be right in here somewhere. We're looking out from the bay in this view. So now, spinning back out onto the Mediterranean. Right now, you're about to see one of the most beautiful cathedrals in the world. And it happens to be in Africa, in Algiers. You'll see it in just a sec. Here we go. This is called Our Lady of Africa, and it's Bicentennial Colgate here. It was built around the same time as our university, and it still functions today. So we flew a couple kites, flying out again over the ocean. And let's eavesdrop on some people, because why not? Guy hanging out with his dog. Remember, everybody thought desert, sand, hot weather, not Mediterranean. There's really great seafood in Algiers, if you like seafood. And you can kind of tell why from this setting. So we are going here. And this bad boy is huge. This is the Martyrs Memorial to the revolution that started in 1954 and ended up in the Avian Accords in 1962, which is what we started out with that fireworks display celebrating. But I want to take you as close as possible because the Martyrs Memorial is one of my favorite places, even within my favorite place. So we're going to check it out from the air because this is huge. It's way bigger than that Sphinx that you saw before, to put it into context for you. This is the Martyrs Memorial from the air, and this is a masterpiece of engineering. It's basically mostly concrete, and it is built on the site of an ancient fort. Okay, the Kasbah is over there, just so that you guys keep a reference point. And it's looking out over this hill into the waters because it's memorializing all of the people that died in the war against France, hence the name. Another nickname for Algeria is the country of a million martyrs. According to Algeria, the figures differ depending on who you ask, but it's alleged that 1 million people died in the war against France, and this is their memorial. So I really want you to get a sense of a couple different things while we're looking at this. First up, how huge this guy is. And if you think about how we saw the air overlooking the bay, it's honestly kind of a giant middle finger across the Mediterranean at France about the colonial period. That's one of the functions. Can you make out what this is? If you can't, don't worry about it. But I'm just going to tell you, I took this picture incidentally on Valentine's Day in the middle of the coolest storm I've ever seen in my life. But this is what it looks like when you're staring at it from the side. And this right here, there's 3 of them, of these branches. So I want you to get a sense of what is on each side of this. So I mentioned the Cold War and I mentioned the influence of like Soviet style sort of propaganda. Now this building was actually made by Algerians with the help of some basically Eastern Bloc sculptors, but it was designed at École des Beaux-Arts, Algerian creation. But on the side, the little guy that I pointed out is this one right here. On one of the other sides is this sculpture. And then the third is this guy right here. What you were looking at are sculptures that are supposed to personify different aspects of the revolution and the Algerian people, and the martyrs that died for an independent Algeria. So you've got like the peasant, and then the military struggler, and then someone from the Kabyle speaking area, or essentially the Amazigh speaking area, what have you. But these are sculptures on the side of this massive concrete structure. And now, what I want to do is show you how this basically memorial in space and time looks in 3 dimensions. Henry, I hope that you can make it through this. But if you can't, shut your eyes, totally cool. This is an animation of this structure from basically the inside out and top down that some Algerian architecture students did. Now, I will go ahead and tell you that this was completed and finished in the 80s to coincide with the 20th anniversary of independence. Think about the fact that, 1962 is before my time, it's before your time, but there's still people living today that fought this war. So it's not that far away in Algerian consciousness, right? Makes all the sense in the world. So some of these captions, although they are in French, English, and Arabic, some of them are a little bit salty, especially the ones in Arabic, and you can kind of understand why there's a little bit of tension, because this is comparatively recent history, right? So now you are looking at the monument to the martyrs, and interestingly enough, I'll flag it in a second. Okay, in this central courtyard looking thing underneath, you have an eternal flame that's burning always to commemorate the folks that died. And then underneath it, you have basically a national museum. Unfortunately, you can't see it in this reconstruction, but underneath that, you have a massive club that is basically where you go out dancing. It's really fun. You should go to Algiers, check it out. This right here is inspired by a minaret on a mosque, even though the form is very clearly influenced by this whole non-aligned style of sort of Soviet sympathy architecture, I guess you could say. So this probably isn't the first piece of architecture that would come to mind if I said to you North Africa, right? Might look much different in your head. So unfortunately, this absolutely kills me, but we're gonna leave Algeria, unfortunately, because I want to take you to one more place before I send you back to Hamilton. Now, why not go to Qatar? So we are going from North Africa all the way to the actual Gulf, this teeny tiny peninsula called Qatar, or Qatar you might hear. And specifically, we're going to Doha. And I checked you guys into the Sheraton Hotel. So I want you to see just kind of a landscape, what this place looks like. Remember when we talked about the problems with Thomas Friedman's headline? You guys remember what that headline was? Yell it out. Absolutely, crazy poor Middle Easterners was the headline, which we had the skyline of Dubai behind, right? Some parts of the Middle East are not doing so badly when it comes to finances. Qatar is one of these places. So just so you get the sense of what this kind of space-age architectural landscape looks like with a lot of oil revenue, you're looking at it right here. And before I take us back home to Hamilton, we are going to check out one more museum, very briefly. So we're still in Doha, we're still in Qatar. We're going over to a place called the Museum of Islamic Art. We're not going to get to go inside today, hopefully later on in the semester, but because the Gulf states are basically just extra, all right? Extra is all that I can think right now. This is an artificial island that was built specifically for the museum. It's supposed to resemble one of the sailing ships that was used in the Indian Ocean called the dhow in abstract form. Don't worry about the term, we'll talk about it later. But this is the Museum of Islamic Art, and the reason that I'm taking you here is, do you remember the Louvre and how we went from pyramids in Egypt to pyramids in the Louvre? The same person that designed those pyramids in the Louvre is the designer of this particular museum. This is I.M. Pei, not a Qatari, but the same person that did the giant pyramids in the Louvre. So I just want you to get a sense one more time of how interconnected all of these parts of the world are and have been. But our final stop, does anyone know where the Pope is today? I know it sounds really random, but the Pope is actually in the Emirates today. It's the first time that a Catholic Pope has been to the Gulf. It's a big deal because there's a lot of Catholics in the Emirates. So why not go ahead and show you a cathedral that happens to be in Doha? So we're ending our journey with a nod to the Pope because we're going to Our Lady of the Rosary, which is this building right here, located in Doha, and we're going to check it out from the outside. And we talked about this before in class, but remember the quiz that I made you take that was super evil and no one knew the answers, but it's fine because it was just to mess with our heads? Like the Emirates, Qatar is mostly, in terms of demographics and population, inhabited by non-Qataris, a lot like the UAE. While we might have cathedrals and so on and so forth in the Levant, where Christianity starts basically, you don't have a lot of them in the actual Gulf. There's not a lot of indigenous Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf region. But what you do have is a significant number of migrant laborers, okay? And amongst them are an awful lot of Catholics. So, for example, the place that we're looking at now, Our Lady of the Rosary, serves a fairly large demographic of Filipinos that are migrant laborers in Doha. And let's close by going inside. And now you're looking at basically the choir space, and it kind of looks like what you might think of evangelical megachurch in Texas might resemble, right? Because you've got your screens up here so that you can follow everything that's going on in the choir. And then you have the three-dimensional figures representing Jesus right here in the center. And this is in, I mean, can we even say the heart of the Middle East or the Middle East at all? But that is our closing sort of moment. And now, unfortunately, we have to go back to Hamilton. But on the long plane ride home, I just want to remind you one last time. Never ever apologize in those response papers because you didn't know something. And please do not feel embarrassed about having a preconception, because I hope you understand a little bit better now where, why, and how we actually got those preconceptions. And unfortunately, I have to let you go. I would keep you in here for the rest of the semester if I could. I would move in here if they would let me. So have a great day. I will email you the second that your responses are graded and outside my door, which as soon as I get back to my office, I'm finishing up. Okay? Make sure that you don't forget your response paper due for today, that you signed in. And I know that the lights are like cat toys and they're really fun. Don't steal them. Throw them in the basket, please. And one more time, thank you for hosting Joe and dealing with our professor and all of her demands. Yeah.
Do you want the lights that aren't working?
I mean, what? Do you want to keep a broken light?
No, I just meant like if you wanted to separate the ones.
Oh, okay, I see what you're
No,
saying.
it's fine.
I'm sorry. I was like, listen, I know everything is memorable. We want souvenirs every class, every teach.
No, I just
He
didn't
said
want
it's
to be
fine.
annoying.
It's totally fine. Yeah, yeah.
What's the percentage of Algerians to French people living in Algeria?
Now?
Yeah.
Oh man, I don't have the exact